This is a person that needs no introduction. From the days of Xamarin University, he's been sharing his wealth of knowledge in all things Xamarin. He's also one of the curators of the weekly Xamarin newsletter and an avid Twitch streamer with his UI challenges, which have kind of turned into its own genre at this point. So without further ado, I'd like to give you Xamarin's own Cockerel Dundee, Kym Phillpotts. Good morning, Phil.
Good morning. Let's hope so. All right. Well, let's go ahead and start the presentation. All right. So welcome to MonkeyFest, everyone. I want to talk to you about building Xamarin Forms UIs and how you can build amazing things from just simple things effectively, right? Because, as developers, one of our key skills is actually going and breaking down hard problems into small problems. So this concept really applies to backend code and algorithms, but you can actually do the same sort of thing and use the same concepts for implementing UIs in Xamarin Forms as well. So by understanding some core concepts and patterns and tricks, you can create some really amazing UIs. Now, my name's Kym Phillpotts. I'm a developer based in Melbourne, Australia. So I'm on the other side of the world. It's 1:30 in the morning for me. I currently work at Microsoft on the Learn team, but before that, I used to work at Xamarin as an instructor at Xamarin University. So none of that really matters other than to say I've been doing Xamarin for quite a while, and I really love the Xamarin platform, building mobile applications in Xamarin as well. So over the past year, what I've been doing, apart from lockdown, is doing a lot of UI challenges to develop my UI skills with Xamarin. And normally what I do is I stream these out onto Twitch, right? By basically taking a design from a design site like Dribbble and then reproducing it in Xamarin Forms. So my objectives here were to learn a little bit more about good design, find patterns to go and implement them in Xamarin Forms as well. So really the question that I set out to answer was, can we create amazing looking applications in Xamarin Forms? And I'm very pleased to announce the answer to that question is yes, we can. So in today's session, I want to share with you some of those designs, talk about some of the techniques to implement them that hopefully you can use to develop your own amazing applications as well. Now, I should say, very importantly, I'm not a designer, okay? But that's okay because you're probably not a designer either. But that doesn't mean you can't appreciate good design and learn a little bit by studying it as well. Okay, so given that I'm not a designer, what I did is I set about finding inspiration for great design from professional designers out there. And there's lots of places you can go to get this inspiration. A couple of my favorite design-specific sites are Dribbble and Behance. But you might also want to go and have a look at apps in the store and have a look at, draw a bit of inspiration from those. Now, when I started doing UI designs in Xamarin Forms, there really weren't a lot of resources out there, and not a lot of people doing it. But now there's a lot of people doing some fantastic UI designs and sharing those out. So here's just a handful of those people. I'm sure I've forgotten some people as well, but I'd highly recommend you follow all these people and also have a look at Javier's repo, the Xamarin Forms good looking UI. So that showcases a lot of Xamarin Forms UIs. So really worth having a look at. Okay, so where do we start? So let's say you've got yourself a lovely design, or maybe you're lucky enough to work with a designer, which I'm not, but maybe you are. The very first thing I like to do is actually just go and break down the design into its components. Basically go and recreate it myself in my favorite design tool, which for me at the moment is Adobe XD. But it really doesn't matter. Some people like to use Sketch, some people use Figma. For me, I like Adobe XD because there's a free version for personal use, and it's also cross-platform as well. So it's a really nice application. Now, as I said, what I do is I recreate these designs. And the reason I recreate these is that it builds my skills using the design tools, which I think is becoming very, very important for mobile developers. Now, most importantly, by reproducing it, what I need to do is actually break apart the design and look at all the things that make it up. And that's a very, very valuable experience to spend time trying to understand some of the decisions that designers make. And the key things that I'm looking for when I'm breaking down a design is the page structure, the fonts and the font sizes, the colors, You know, and all of these things, particularly like fonts, they're very, very important for design. So you want to spend some time having a look at that. So yeah, like I said, the colors, the spacing and the margin, the general page layout, and also the assets that are used inside of there as well. So, you know, sometimes I recreate assets, other times I'll go and have a look on the internet and find some that are appropriate. But, you know, if you're working with a designer, they'll probably just give them to you. So once we've got a good grasp of the elements from a design, really you're in a position to start implementing it. Now, I like to work in XAML. That's my personal preference. Everyone's different. Some people prefer C#, you know, do their UIs in C#. I like XAML. So what I do, because I'm in the XAML world, is I pull everything into resources and styles. And I guess I'm actually pretty lazy. I tend to keep things in the app.xaml file. But obviously, if you're working on a big project, then maybe you'd split those into separate files for colors and sizes and styles and things like that. But look, this is sort of what I'm gathering. I'm gathering colors, sizes, styles, and also I put in any implicit styles here as well. So these are things that I want to apply to all controls of a particular type. So typical ones I put in here are things like for grids, I get rid of that nasty row spacing. For frames, I get rid of those nasty shadows, and that will just apply everywhere. But the idea of putting all of this stuff into your resource dictionaries, and why I'd recommend doing it straight away, is you're going to be a lot more consistent inside of your application. But also when you start building your application, it's going to take shape much faster, and it's going to have the right colors, and it's a nice feedback loop. And then later on, when you want to tweak it, it's really, really easy to go and tweak that sort of in one place. Okay, now let's do a bit of a review for some of the key concepts that you might need to build just about any UI effectively. And let's start with layout containers. So for those of you who've done Xamarin development, which I'm assuming is most of us, you'll know that pages are built up with this idea of containers, and basically layout control, you know, layout containers. And there's lots of them, but you shouldn't worry, because really I think you can just about do any layout with basically these 4 containers. So the first one is the stack layout. Stack layout's really nice. It's a very lightweight container. It's useful for laying things out vertically or horizontally. It's a managed container, which means that you just add children to it and it just lays it out. And in my experience, most layouts are going to use a stack layout somewhere. Okay, what it's not good for is overlapping content, right? So which is an important consideration. The next thing we have is an absolute layout. So this is an unmanaged container, what I refer to as an unmanaged container, which basically means you're responsible for saying how children are laid out. So you can kind of think of it like a canvas, if you like, and you put the controls on, you tell it where things need to be. Now, it's super powerful, but it's also super complex as well. But it's very, very useful if you want maximum control. Now, the next one is the scroll view. It's a little bit of a weird one, I suppose, because you know, it's sort of a container for containers, and it's worth knowing about because none of the layout containers have the ability to scroll. And as you'll be aware, you know, often we're having to deal with different size screens, and so scrolling is often a consideration. So, you know, you'll quite often use a stack layout as well. Now, I've left the best till last, the grid. So grids I think are the real workhorse of layouts. They make really good sort of root containers. They are a managed container, so you put views into particular cells, but you can have content that spans rows and columns, right? All in all, it's very, very flexible, and it's sort of my go-to. I've got a saying, basically, when in doubt, use a grid layout. It kind of rhymes as well. All right, let's have a look at a really straightforward layout here. Let's say we've got this profile page. Now, with layouts, there's a lot of different ways you can build the same layout, okay? So in this case here, I might choose to use a grid, and I might have a row for the header, the row for the body, and a row for the footer. Now, in this middle section here, this sort of just lays out down the page. So I might use a vertical stack layout inside of there. Cool. And then this middle bit here, we've got a few things sort of grouped here, and we want them lined up. So a good choice there is a grid. Right, so you can see that there's a nesting of layouts. Now, like I said, there's a lot of ways you could do this. You could instead, for example, just have a grid with 3 columns, and then have stack layouts inside them. That would work just as well. Okay, so that's a really simple example. Let's have a look at a very, very common requirement for layouts, and that is to have overlapping elements, right? So you'll find this in design all over the place. So I think it's important just to make sure people understand this this sort of concept. So let's have a look at say this application here. Okay, so this has a little bit of overlapping content here. This search bar is here. Apart from that, it's got a header and it's got sort of a collection view that's going on here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to flick over to a little bit of code here, and let's just sort of construct that. Now, I'm not going to live code this, mostly because I'm not crazy, okay? And it does require a little bit of code. But what we'll do is we'll just have a look at how it might be positioned. So pretty much the page itself is going to be a grid with 2 rows in it, right? It's going to have a row for the header and then a row for the body. Okay, now in the header, now for this, I'm using the pancake view. It turns out actually there's probably ways of doing this now without using the pancake view, but pancake view is a great control. It's pretty much just giving me the corner radius and the cropping here. Now inside of this, maybe what I want to do is in the header, I've got a grid. Now the reason I've got a grid here is that I just want to keep everything so it can overlay each other. So let me go and uncomment that. Okay, so we start off with a media element here. Beautiful. Now, the next thing that we have inside of here is we might want to overlay a bit of a gradient here. Okay, so I've used a pancake view here. I wrote this sample a while ago, so actually we could probably now use the newer capabilities. But the pancake view is just adding that gradient over top of the video itself, and then I've got a stack layout. Okay, and so the stack layout is just giving us this content here, which is the couple of labels and the divider inside of them. Okay, and you notice I'm using styles in here. Beautiful. All right, so we've got a header. We've got overlapping elements in there. Really cool. The next thing we have is we've got this search box. All right, so I'm going to just uncomment this. Okay, so here, this is sort of a bit of a fancy search box. So it's got a grid in here as well. So it's got the entry field, and it's got an image button on the side here. So that's all good and fine. Okay, and then down the bottom, okay, in grid row 1. Okay, and I should point out that let me uncomment this. See if that takes. There we go. We've got our collection view down the bottom here. Okay, so that's cool. That's grid row 1. I should point out the search box is in grid row 1 as well, but it's got this translation, which is basically pushing it up the screen a little bit. Okay, now there is a problem with this, right? The problem with this is if I go and scroll this, oops, that's not scrolling, that's clicking. If I go and scroll this, you can see that my collection view scrolls behind my search box. So this is kind of what I wanted to talk to you about, which is sometimes you've got to care about the order that things are, right? So even though the pancake view appears higher in the page, okay, we want it to be rendered on top of the collection view. So the right thing here would be to actually move this down after the collection view, okay? And if I go and save that, do a refresh, what we should see is now the collection view slides in behind it, okay? So the order that we put things in is super important. That's just a really key thing to know about effectively. All right, so hopefully that makes sense, what we're doing there. Now let me just sort of flick back to my slides here. That's not my slides. That's my slides. Let's talk about some other things that we might want to know about. So these are sort of like the key things that you need to know about. I'll get rid of my phone there. Positioning views. Okay, so these are some properties that you want to know about. horizontal options, vertical options, margins, padding, spacing. So these are all probably things you're fairly familiar with. Okay, so I won't go into any depth here because the documentation does a really, really good job of actually describing them. But make sure you understand these properties really well. And there's also another set of properties which you'll find are very, very useful as well. So these are the transform properties: translation X, translation Y, scale, rotations, opacities. So these can make a big difference as well. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to mirror my iPhone here. Let's see how this goes. And I just want to show you a quick sample. All right, of these transforms. Okay, so what this application here is it's just a grid, really. It's just got a picture of a spaceman inside of a grid, and then we can adjust things like the scale property on it. And these are bindable properties. So all I've done is I've bound the value of these sliders to the appropriate property on the control. And what you can see is that we can, adjust where things are in here, and things like rotation as well. So it actually performs very, very well. We can adjust all of these different elements in here. All right, so the other important thing to note here as well is all of those properties are animatable, right? So you can see we've got our translate to, scale to, so we can use these animation extensions, and that's super useful when we're going to be implementing our application. Look at that, my notifications aren't off. All right, beautiful. Let's have a look at a couple of tips for debugging your layouts, right? Because before we move on, it's worth mentioning that getting your layout right can be very, very tricky, right? And there's often a lot of trial and error involved in it. So the two things that I would really recommend is using something like XAML Hot Reload, so you can instantly see your changes. And there's also another really great package called Debug Rainbows, right, which allows you to visualize the bounds of your views. So this is really cool. If you haven't used this before, let me just show you on our application we had a little while ago. So this is a NuGet package. So we can basically bring this in, and let's say we wanted to have a look. We wanted to say turn on a grid here. Okay, so I can say show grid is true, and then it shows me a grid here. Or if you're trying to debug where the bounds of your layouts are, the other thing you do as well is you can show colors. And this is kind of funky because what it does is it basically just applies a random color behind each of your controls. So it lets you know where the bounds of everything live, which is very, very useful. All right, cool. So with that, let's come back over to the slides, because we know just about everything we need to know to build some amazing things. So let's have a look at some designs first of all, okay, and just talk about how they're implemented. So this first one here is one that was by a designer called Alex Pasenka. I implemented this one here just using Xamarin Forms. Now, again, it used the pancake view and the image circle. These days, I could get away with not actually using that. But what's interesting about this design is some of the pop-ups. So let's say I click on a good friend Vincent here. It pops up a little section down here, and you notice that it also fades the background as well, right? And if I click on it again, it pops up a little bit further, and we've got a collection view down the bottom here, right? And if I click outside of there, it unfades the background and brings it back in. Also, if I make a bid here, it can pop up this bottom section here. So it has these bottom pop-up tabs, which are very, very common inside of a lot of applications. All right, so let's have a look at how we achieve this sort of stuff, right? So how to pop up and fade a background. So the basic structure of this page is we've got our page content. It's pretty much built using grids, okay? But we've got our content there just as you would for a normal page. In order to do the fading, what we have is we've got a box view that sits over the whole thing that has some opacity built into it, right? So it's basically got, it's a see-through gray, if you like. And then what we have is we've got a content view, which is the content we actually want to slide into view. So using the properties that we already know about, right, these translation properties, what we can do is when we start our application, we can translate that content view down and we make our box view invisible. Okay, so it looks like just a normal page. Okay, when the user clicks on it and it comes up, we adjust the translation of that pop-up, and then we turn on the visibility. We fade this background in, right? And so therefore it fades out the background here. And the code is super simple, right? We basically just say, let's make our fader visible. Let's fade it to 1. Okay, let's fade it in. And then let's just translate that artist detail up effectively. Okay, so nice, easy code. The user clicks on it again, it goes up even further. So all we do is we translate it up a little bit further, right? Okay, the user clicks outside and we basically go ahead, we translate that artist detail page back down off the page. We fade out the box view here, and then eventually we make it invisible as well. That's just to stop it interrupting the user's input, basically. Okay, the one thing to notice about here is these translate to and fade to methods, they're awaitable. So what this is really doing is it's saying, let's run these animations. Let's wait till that one finishes. When it finishes, let's call this one here. Beautiful. All right, and so that's how we can achieve that sort of layout. Now, let's talk about building some interactions into our application, right? And it turns out that what I've found is there's really 2 types of interactions that we have. The first is non-real-time interaction. So non-real-time means that the object behavior is post-interactive. So it occurs after the user action, right? So it's kind of like a transitional thing. So for example, the way this flips when the user taps on it, okay? So it happens only after input from the user. So there's some really good examples of this. I found a good site, or sorry, a good design called Unzone, which I replicated. And this was a design by Rick Walders. There's just Xamarin Forms code in here, nothing else going on. Whoop, except me turning my phone. So let's have a look at some coolness with this. So what happens is we've got a collection view here. If I go and tap on one of these elements, let's say I tap on Helen, okay? It does an interesting thing. It fades out everything except the cell that I selected. Pops up this sort of dialogue, if you like. If I hit the delete button, it does a nice little flip, says, hey, you sure you want to delete this? Well, I'm not, so I'll say no, and it fades back. And it's also got this cool little spinner cancel button down the bottom. All right, so this is an example of this sort of interaction that we're talking about. Okay, so let's have a quick discussion about how we would achieve this. So basically a more advanced pop-up, if you like. Okay, so the first thing is we've got our page. Our page is just a collection view that sits here. In order to do the fade out, so when the user clicks on the cell, it fades the background out. We know how to do that, right? We just talked about it. We're going to have a box view which has an opacity inside of there. The real trick here is how do we keep that cell from fading? Well, this is where in UI design, there's a lot of smoke and mirrors. The way I achieve this is really just to have a copy of the cell, right? And when the user taps, it gets the binding context for the selected item and sets the binding context on that copied cell. And then it places it, so it has the same data, and then it places it at exactly the same position as where that cell was, as that selected item, right? And so for that, using like an absolute layout and a bounds is very useful, right? Because it allows us to say, get the selected cell, get the bounds of the cell, get my new cell, put it exactly where that one was. Okay, and we can achieve effects like this very, very simply. All right, now there's another cool effect in here, which is where this dialogue sort of folds down effectively. All right, and if we have a look at the code for this, it's really quite simple, right? We've got open drop down for our delete, our edit, and our info. So these sort of pop down and they fade in. And it's really just saying, when I open the dropdown, make it visible, turn its rotation to -90. So what that means is it's like basically sitting flat to the screen, or poking out from the screen so the user can't see it. So it's starting folded up. We set its opacity to 0, and then what we do is we fade it in and we rotate it at the same time. Okay, and so it sort of folds in like that. Now, there is a bit of a trick with this one, and that is understanding this anchor X and this anchor Y property. Okay, because we don't want it to rotate from this center point, right? We actually want it to rotate from this point here, and this one to rotate from here, and this one to rotate from here, so that it actually folds down. So anchor X, anchor Y is very useful to know about for things like rotations. Okay, and that's basically how you achieve that effect. Now, the other effect that we have on here is we've got ourselves a pretty funky little flip here. When we hit the delete button, it flips around. Okay, and in fact, if I say yes, it folds up and it closes that. So something like a flip effect is really, so I've got a method here, flip from a particular element to another element. Okay, so the very first thing that we do is we rotate the from control, so the blue side here, we rotate it around to -90. Okay, and what that's going to do is it's going to bring it around like that. Then what we do is we hide that control, we hide our from, we make our to visible, but its rotation is set to be edge on as well. And then what happens is we go and get the to one, which is the incoming one, and then we rotate that in. Okay, and that's all you need to do. So you can see with just some simple use of those controls, those animation properties, you can achieve some pretty cool things. Now, one thing you might notice about this is that when that dialog flips, so if I hit the delete button here, for example, it sort of springs as it does it. And in fact, this is where you'll want to have a look at easings. Okay, so you notice here when we rotate, we use some spring ins and some spring outs here. So these are super useful, right? Easing functions, because objects in real life don't just start and stop, right? And things almost never move at a constant speed. So easing functions specify the rate of change of a parameter over time. So if you're going to put animations into your applications, I would highly suggest you investigate easings, right? They're going to make your animations feel much more natural. Now, a good reference site for understanding easings is this one here called easings.net. Or I believe David Ortonow has actually been creating a Xamarin Forms application for this as well, to actually go and visualize those easings. But understand a little bit about easings, and that will help you out quite a bit. Now, the other element that's in this, this design as well is this nice little button that floats in from the bottom. Okay, if you hit the cross button, you can see it sort of floats in. And this is just an extension of exactly the same concept. All we're doing is we've got this button, we're fading it to a particular value, we're rotating it, and we're translating it, right? But they're all happening at the same time. And this is why it's useful to break down designs and animations, because you get to understand how the different parts work together. Okay, and what you'll notice is that easings are used in here as well. That's how it gives it the nice sort of fluid approach. Okay, so that's how we can do a floaty button like that. Now let's move on to the second type of interaction, right? And that's real-time interaction. So real-time means that the user is directly interacting with the object, right, in the user interface. So you can also think of this as like direct manipulation, right, in that the user is interacting with the interface object directly, and the behavior of the interface is happening as the user is using it, right? And I think this is really cool because it makes the user feel connected to the application, right? It's by far my favorite type of interaction that we have. Okay, so let's have a look at an example of this. Let me just bring this app up on my phone. Here we go. Okay, so what we have here is we've got ourselves a nice little application called Marvel Movies Interaction. Now, this used a few different controls. It used Xamarin Forms. Now, it used Pancake View and Skisharp and Cards View. Now, again, I think we could nowadays, with all of the enhancements that have happened with Xamarin Forms, actually get away without the Pancake View and the Skisharp, right? Because really that was used to create some of the rounding that we can now get for free. The real hero here, I think, is this Cards View, which is by Andre. This is a really, really cool control. It gives very flexible ways of producing like carousel views effectively. So let's have a look at this, this application. All right, so what's cool about this and why I like this design is if I go and grab this card and I start swiping, okay, you see a few things happen. It's adjusting those images. It's adjusting the opacity of those cards as well, okay? And so as we sort of switch in between them, we can see it's doing some pretty cool stuff. And then, you know, and so it feels like you're really connected to the application, which is really nice. And if we click the Learn More, okay, it pops up the content here and we can see the movies that are all about Spider-Man, and we go back and we're back in here. Okay, so a really, really nice little application. Now, if we come and have a look at how this is structured, we've just got a page container. It uses a grid. The next thing we have is we've got a card view, okay, that sits on top of here. Okay, and then what we have is we've got just the overlays, like the movies header and the back button. Now, the only sort of trick here is that the cards, even though they look like they only occupy about 2/3 of the screen, they actually are full screen, right? But it's just the top bit is transparent, right? So the card actually occupies the entire space. It's just got a transparent section at the top here. And that matters because the illusion with this design is that the hero image looks like they're extending beyond the card, right? But we still want it to move with the card. And so clever use of things like transparency can help you out here. Okay, so let's have a look at how this is sort of how this movement happens, right? So when I sort of swipe between these pages here, okay, all we're really doing is we're measuring the distance, right? We're basically just, you know, how far off center are we effectively? How far are we scrolling that? And then, or swiping that. And then we're just using that to influence like the opacity, the scale, the translation of the various elements on the front card. And then we have something similar on the back card as well, right? We're just adjusting the opacity, the scale, and the offset of that back image. And again, it's using concepts that we're already familiar with, just using them in clever ways effectively. Okay, so that is how you do this real-time interaction. Now, we're not all creating applications with flying superheroes, but the same concept as well can be used to do a much more traditional use case, right? So let's say, you know, the old use case where you've got a panel which you want to slide up, and perhaps you want it to snap to the top or the bottom. Okay, so in this case here, what I've got is I've got a content view, which is my front card. Okay, and all it has is it's got a pan gesture recognizer. Okay, on the top here. Okay, and then all we do is we just have a little bit of code which influences this. So we've got our pan updated. So this is when we're panning. Basically, when it's running. So in other words, when the user is moving this around, what we're doing is we're adjusting the translation. So we're moving this card up and down. Okay, and then when it's completed for bonus points, we do the snapping. We can just basically say, hey, if where it's translated to is less than my expand threshold, you know, then expand, otherwise it's collapsed. And all we're doing is we're just doing a translate to in order to either snap it at the top or snap it at the bottom. So, you know, you can apply that really nicely. And it turns out, you know, everyone loves parallax and parallax scrolling. And this is where we have different elements that all move at different speeds on our screen. And again, parallax is just translations based on a multiplier, really, when it comes down to it. So once the user, scrolls the position and we work out how far the offset is, we can translate each element with different values by actually just using that multiplier. Okay, and so in this case, we know where we're scrolling to. We apply different translations with different modifiers for each of our elements, and we get parallax scrolling. It's a beautiful thing. Okay, let's have a look quickly back at this, this card transition. So when I click on Learn More here, okay, this content slides up the page. Okay, so what it looks like is it's moving to another page, right? And it looks like that card is sort of expanding out as well, and that image is moving across to the second page. Well, it actually turns out, in reality, the card doesn't expand, right? The card is already the full height of the screen, right? All it really is just this red background that goes up further and expands up higher. And then once that expands up, we then have a gradient that slides up, a white gradient that goes up the page. Okay, so so it looks like we've sort of transitioned through a page, and then the other elements animate in, right? So these other elements were actually sitting on here, but they were just translated out and had their opacity down. So then they sort of fly into the screen. All right, so that's a nice little funky card transition for you. Now, let's talk about another form of animation, which is called state-based animations. So with this one here, we've got a cool application called the Pizza Shop. All right. So I'll go to add to cart here. So what's cool about this one is, in order to select the size of the pizza, we can use this little button here, and we can expand it out to medium or large, in case you didn't know what a small, medium, and large pizza was. Okay, and we can basically animate those through its various states. And then if we want, we can add in the quantity. So I can press this button down here, and the pizza flies down into the bottom button. So it's a really nice sort of visual that I've ordered that pizza. Okay, like so. And if I'm at medium, it's going to go from medium. If I'm at large, it's going to go from large. And if I reduce the quantity, it's going to sort of regurgitate that pizza back out. Just a little bit gross, but that's the idea of this application. Now, with this application, what we have is we've got multiple states in it, right? But the actual layout of the page itself is we've got a main container with the grid. Inside of the top section, we have an absolute layout, right? And what that does is that contains our pizza. And the reason we might choose an absolute layout for this is because we need very precise control over where things are going to be positioned, right? And so absolute layout helps us to do that. And then we've got a button down the bottom. Now, again, there's lots of ways you could do it. You could probably just ditch the grid and just have the whole thing as a absolute layout if you really wanted to. Okay. And then we have another layout, which is our labels and our control down here for adding and removing quantities. So again, you can see this concept of having overlaying controls is very important. Now, with this application, if we come back to it, we kind of got these different states that we're moving through: small, medium, large. Okay. So for that, when you've got that sort of situation, which has different states, it's really good idea to use something called a state engine or a state engine type approach, where you set up the position of the elements for each state, right? And then your engine basically does the work for you. So this is a concept I picked up off the Xamarin developer blog. So there was a blog post called Complex Animations Using a Finite State Machine, which sounds really funny or really hardcore, but in reality, all it means is we have this helper method, and we start off by just describing our states. So it can just be an enum. So we've got a small, medium, and large. Great. Then what we do is we tell the state engine where these things should be, right? So in this case here, we say animate state engine, when the state is small, okay, this is where I want the pizza to be. Okay, this is the rectangle I want it to occupy. This is the rotation. And then under the medium state, here's the rotation and the layout, and under the large state. So it's a much more declarative way of doing your animations. Okay, so we create the transforms for different states. And then when we want to move between those states, all we do is we tell the animation engine, hey, go to this state. So if I'm small, go to medium. If I'm medium, go to large. If I'm large, go to small. Okay, and the animation engine actually just does that for you. So that's where the magic happens effectively. Okay, so this is a really, really cool technique. So I used as a basis the one that was from that blog post, but I've sort of extended it out a little bit as well. So later on, I'll show you where all the code's available. You can go and steal that for your own. But if you've got UIs where you're going to have multiple things are positioned for different states, this is probably a really good way of going. Okay, let's talk about some of the cool things of this design. So how do we eat the pizza, right? So this is, when the user does this, how does that move down to the side or move back up here? Okay, so this is the code for the pizza flying. It's not too much code. The trick here, though, is that there's actually an invisible pizza. Right? There's an invisible pizza that sits on exactly over top of the one that you can see. Okay, so when the user clicks this button, we make that invisible pizza visible. That's our flying pizza. Right? And again, we use our absolute layout bounds. We set it to be exactly on the top of it. We work out where it needs to be. So we can look at our button here. We can look at the bounds of our button. Okay, and we basically create ourselves a rectangle, which is where we're going to. Okay, so this is why it's good to understand a little bit about things like bounds as well. And then we animate the pizza down. So the animation of the pizza is just doing a layout and a rotate. Okay, so just the same code as we've seen before. Then we do a little bit of a tricky thing here where we open up this button. And again, this is really just working out the new rectangle. So in other words, we're sort of working out, we're saying we're going to go to that size, for example. Okay. And then we lay that out. We say, hey, let's resize that button. And we also rotate the pizza in as well so that it rotates in there. And then we close the button. We basically set the button back to its original layout. Okay. And then turn our flying pizza off. Beautiful. So that's how we achieve that sort of effect. Now, most of you are not going to write applications with flying pizzas, but you can well imagine this same sort of concept might be applicable for, say, a shopping application where when somebody adds something into the cart, a little icon flies up into the cart. Okay, same sort of concept that you'd use there. Okay, the other cool thing with this design is it's got this nice little spinning counter that's down the bottom. You can create something like this really easy as well once you understand some of these simple things. In our case, what I did is I created a custom control. Okay, all it was a grid with two labels in it, the current label and the next label, and they're just sort of centered right in the middle. Okay, and that's the same control here and here. It had a bindable property called text property. And all we're really doing here is when that text property changes, okay, applying text, all we do is we get the current one, we translate it up, okay, and then fade it out. So, the label basically comes up here and it fades as it goes. And then the next label, we put it down here, we start it transparent, and then we make it visible as it comes in the page. Piece of cake. All right, so that's how you can apply those simple concepts to something like that. Now, everything we've seen so far is pretty much just straight Xamarin Forms, right? But what I wanted to have a look at is a few situations where you get to a point where you can't just do it in Xamarin Forms anymore. What do we do? What are our options and what sort of libraries do we have? The most useful library I find, at least for the sort of UIs that I do, is Skisharp. If you're going to be doing a lot of UI, I highly recommend you learn about Skisharp. It's a cross-platform engine, so the beauty of this is that you can just write your code once, okay, and it's going to work on iOS and Android and UWP and like 50 other different platforms as well. It's really amazing for creating custom drawings. It's really, really fast. And it's also really, really powerful as well. It does get a bit complex when you start trying to do some really funky things, but the documentation and the samples for this are amazing. So Matt LeBeau has done an amazing job. Everything I ever wanted to do with Skisharp, there was a sample already for it, which is great. And if you want to learn more about Skisharp, you want to have a look. Michael Stonis has a session later on where he delves into Skisharp in a lot more depth. So go and check that one out. But what I wanted to show you is a couple of examples of where I've used Skisharp. So one of these is a little application called Day versus Night. Okay, and the actual main page of this is pretty much just straight Xamarin Forms. The interesting bit is this temperature control here, right? And when you start breaking down a page, after a while, it becomes fairly clear. You look at this and you go, okay, all of this stuff at the top, yep, I can do that. You have a look at this temperature control and go, that's a little bit special, right? And so I'm going to have to custom render that. And Skisharp is a really, really good option for that because it's a little bit more complex than it at first appears because it's got like this cutout that goes above it, if you can see that. Okay, so that's a design by Ionet Zamfir. Really cool. Again, there's probably a few libraries we could drop off here, but hopefully it gives you the idea. And also this does theming as well, like so. All right, let's talk about the page layout here, just to so you can understand how this sort of works. All I did here is I had a grid with 2 rows. The only reason I used a grid in this case was just because there's this bottom bar down here, and I figured that always wants to stay down the bottom. And so grids are really useful for that sort of stuff. Then on top of that, I had a gradient. I drew this in Skisharp because it was done before any of the gradient goodness has been added in. So I should probably go back and update all these samples. But Skisharp will definitely do it. And the reason I used Skisharp as well is because it had gradients going through multiple colors. But I think the background or the gradient stuff we have now can probably do that. It's got an image. So the image sort of went down the bottom here. Okay, beautiful. So anytime you want a background, this is kind of how you do it. You know, if you've got something like a grid, you can just put these, just make sure they're at the bottom, or sorry, at the top of your XAML page so that they're the first things rendered. So everything else sort of renders on top of it. Have a collection view here, and then the main part of the page, right? And for this here, when you sort of look at this, you go, okay, well, there's some things that are lined up here. You know, we want this to be lined up. And so there was a grid here. I put another grid in here. Again, there's other ways you could do it. You get down to this bit here and you think, oh, that there, that's going to be Skisharp. Okay, so that part there is Skisharp. And then we just have collection views down the bottom here. Okay, so that's basically how this one is laid out. Creating a Skisharp control is not that dissimilar to creating a normal control in Xamarin Forms. It's just you're using rendering logic from Skia in order to do it. So in my case here, I had a touch effect, so as I could detect where the touch was at any point. Okay, and then the way Skisharp works is it's kind of more like a game engine. You have like a render cycle, and so anytime you want it to update, you just invalidate the surface. So anytime this moved, okay, I invalidate the surface, and then it calls down here. And probably the coolest thing about this is the way it creates the clipping path. And so I don't know, probably Michael Stonis will go into this a little bit more detail, but you can do cool things with Skisharp. Like you can say, hey, I want this clipping path here, and then everything else I draw is going to be clipped around this section, right? And again, we might actually be able to do this in the newer versions of Xamarin Forms, but Skisharp, really, really useful for this sort of stuff. Let's just have a look at another one here. So let me show you this application. This is Mountain Mobile. This is a really nice design. I enjoyed this one here. This is very much a Skisharp-y type of thing. So at the top we have this ability to move through as we scroll through our particular elements here. And there's actually quite a bit going on in there. It's sort of resizing images, it's moving, it's doing a bit of parallax in there, it's adjusting opacities. Fair amount of stuff going on in there, but it's all just done in Skisharp. So the code is written once and it's shared across all of the platforms. And when we have a look at the landscape version of this one, the way it's structured, okay, I've just got a grid with 2 rows. At the top here, I've got a skier surface. So this is where I'm drawing my bitmaps. But the really nice thing about Skisharp is you can have all of your normal Xamarin Forms stuff interact with it as well. So I've got Xamarin Forms labels down here. I didn't have to draw text in Skisharp. Even these buttons up here are Xamarin Form images as well, right? So we can lay those things together. Beautiful. And let me show you the landscape version of this page. Okay, so this is the landscape version of this page. And with this one, if I go and click on the little arrows here, so I'm touching these arrows, what we're doing is we're doing some really nice transitions between them. So if you have a look at something like this, the bitmap functionalities that exist within Xamarin Forms are a little bit limited, so you're not going to be able to do that. So Skisharp is a good option for that one. Okay, so that's an example of what you can do with Skisharp. The way this is actually sort of structured, the page just uses Skisharp. That's where the images exist. We then have these overlays on here, and this is all just standard Xamarin Forms controls that sit on there. Okay. The good thing about Skisharp is, like I said, it's kind of just like a game engine. You can just just invalidate the surface and you can get it to redraw. So you draw each frame. So the way that the animation was done for the landscape version, where it was sliding in bands, is I basically set up some custom animations. Okay, and all this is doing is saying, get these values, go in between start and end, so on the screen and off the screen, and I just offset those by slightly different values, right? So each band was moving just a little bit at different times. And then I had an animation which basically said, as I go through here, let's go and invalidate the surface. And that what was doing is causing it to redraw, okay? And we did that thing over 2 seconds. And then in the actual code, so this is what the invalidate calls, the paint surface, it'd just go and pick up those values that were being animated and then draw those slices of the images, okay, at different positions. And that's how you can animate Skisharp. It's a beautiful thing. Now, just to sort of finish this off, let's have a look at some interactions that sort of go a little bit beyond Skisharp as well. So the first is multi-page animations, right? So this is where you actually want to transition pages and move elements between the different pages. And so for this, there is a really cool library which I've used called the Xamarin plugin Shared Transition, which does a really, really nice job of this. Essentially what you do is you have an element on one page, you give it a tag to say, hey, this is my selected image. On your second page, you have another element which has the same transition name, and then you basically tell the transition, I want to move between these pages here, and that will actually go and do that for you. So let me have a quick look. Let's see if we can bring this one up. Okay, so for example, if I select this chair, okay, it actually moves to a second page there and animates that. Likewise, if I come here, select some different colors on here and then go back, it's basically animating that element between us. And that's all done by this shared transition, okay? Because it's kind of platform specific stuff, but luckily the Xamarin community is so awesome that somebody's already written it for us. Another example of this is, here we go. Here's another example. This is a kind of pretty wacky application, but it's a book swap application. And what we can do is we can select a book, okay? And you can see it animates those elements onto the second page, okay, from where they are down. So that's quite a nice one as well. All right, so that's the shared transitions. The other one or other library, which probably a lot of people know about, is something called Lottie. So this is really for when you have designers who love doing animated illustrations, which are pretty popular these days, actually. So if you need a funky chicken to walk onto your screen and then confetti to explode behind them, then this is pretty much what you want to use. In reality, what you would normally use this for is things like micro interactions on buttons, or for things like loading indicators. But definitely Lottie is one to keep in the back pocket, I suppose, or in the tool belt, as they say. One thing I would warn you about: if you're going to use the latest version of Lottie on Android, make sure that you're also using Android 10 as well, because that will save you a few hours worth of work. And I know that because it took me a few hours to realize that. All right, so with that, let's come back to our original question. Can we create amazing looking applications with Xamarin Forms? Yes. The answer is still yes. We can still create some amazing stuff. All right. So with that, thanks for putting up with me. I have a link here on this slide, which shares out all those designs and all the source code behind those and the GitHub repos, as well as other links I think you might find useful in your quest for building beautiful UIs. So with that, probably a little bit ahead of time. It's 2:20 here in Melbourne. I'm going to hang out a little bit, see if there's any questions in the chat, and if not, have yourself an amazing conference. What I will just quickly do is I'll quickly just show you the link here. Let me just show you that. Let me just MonkeyFest 2020. All right. So in there, we've got all the slides, all of the UI challenges in here. So these are all of the various ones, and links out to the original designs and the GitHub implementations of them as well. So yeah, feel free to go and have a look through some of those. Okay, and also some good inspiration inside of here. Some good people to follow from the UI side of things, and some of my favorite libraries to use as well. Okay, and if you like watching people code, feel free to follow me on Twitch as well. All right. So with that, I think I'm done. All right. Well, I'll leave. So take care, everyone.